for some reason. So I chose YouTube, being that I worked so hard to do it. So, and then people could access it much easier later. Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay, I'm gonna how do I mute the? So hard to do it. So how do I mute it? People can access it much easier. How do I mute the?
Mute it in like through YouTube.
Where?
Like, are you able to open up YouTube? You should mute the video from.
How do I mute this? How?
There should be a. Is there a mic icon? That you see?
How do I mute? Oh, I got it.
And
I got it.
like through YouTube.
Where? Got it. Got it. Okay. Thank you, God. Alhamdulillah. Okay. All right. So that's that. So I guess it's not, I don't know if it'll let me now. It won't. So it just, you can only pick one or the other. You can't do both. For some reason, maybe my account is not the top. So now we're recording and everybody can hear all this. That's okay. All right. So I think we can, the people that are in, there's a few people. So you can, there's 7 people. So I'm gonna start screen sharing right now. And
then I'll let them in as soon as.
Yeah. Minimize. Okay, so this is they'll see this on when they're coming in. So you can let them in now, because I can't see anything really. So thank you for joining us. Welcome, everybody. We have muted everybody as they have coming in. So bear with us. We're going to open it up later for everybody to participate. And we welcome you to our wonderful program today with Dr. Craig Considine, discussing his wonderful new book, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. I will start by saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the infinitely compassionate and merciful. I will also use a prayer used by the Prophet Moses, peace be upon him. قل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. O my Lord, open for me my chest, grant me self-confidence, contentment, and boldness, and ease my task for me, and make loose the knot from my tongue, that they understand my speech. This means I hope that I say everything today correctly and that you will understand me, and you'll have and this program will be very successful and wonderful. I'm just going to move up to this is my website. I'm going to be moving up to the main page of it. These are the different presentations that that I do. And there's testimonials from people that I've done these presentations with. There's also upcoming events here, and down here is a couple of different videos. And so I'm an amateur photographer. I take pictures and I put different prayers that I think are touch my heart and hopefully touch yours. And there's some pictures here of some recent events. I think most of them before COVID, but hopefully we'll begin again doing them. So I think there's a couple of people waiting to come in, and we can bring them in, Fatuma. So I will stop screen sharing now, but I just wanted people to see this as they're coming in. And people are coming in, yes. And I wanted to say peace, salam, and shalom. Thank you so much for everyone for being with us today. And what I pray will be a very informative and fruitful conversation with Dr. Craig Considine. We're delighted that you've joined us today. There are some of you I know personally and hope to make new friends today with the ones that I don't know. And I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ola Nasser. I'm the founder of Our Common Beliefs that I began in March of 2017 after being a victim of several horrific hate crimes in Westchester County, New York, where I've lived for over 50 years. Now you have an idea of how old I am, right? I'm giving it away. My vision is to share the commonality between the Abrahamic faiths from the Islamic perspective. And by doing so, by doing various programs and presentations on Islam, and by doing a program like this with Dr. Craig Considine. I hope by doing so that I pray that it will bring love and harmony to all of our neighbors. I believe that through love, education, and knowledge, we can eradicate hate. Our program today will be until 3:30, and if there's going to be a lot of questions, we hope there's going to be a lot of questions. Maybe if Dr. Craig will be kind, might extend it, but that's the length of our program today. And we're delighted that you will be part of the conversation and cordially invite you to actively participate in the interactive Q&A session. Please note that you will be muted until the end of the program, when you'll be given the opportunity to unmute yourself during the interactive Q&A session. Please keep your questions related to Dr. Craig's books and his work. However, you're most welcome to ask your questions in the chat during the program. And I also want to welcome my new technical assistant. She's there in the background. Her name is Fatuma Hydra, and she'll be assisting us in monitoring the questions in the chat and on YouTube. My co-host and co-sponsor, I couldn't have done this without her, Becca Pugh. She will discuss all those technical details about what to do in the chat and things like that. And she's the wonderful program director of Peace Catalyst International in the DC area. And we met at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, DC in 2020 and have become very good friends. I went to her wedding last year, and we do wonderful programs. And we did a similar program with Dr. Craig last year, and it was very successful. So I would like to formally pass this to Becca so that she can introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Ola. Yes, it was so wonderful how we met and became friends and are now collaborating for peace between our Christian and Muslim neighbors. And like Ola mentioned, I work with Peace Catalyst International in the Washington, DC area. And we have been historically focused on building bridges and bringing reconciliation between Christians and Muslims. And today, our mission is to help equip and mobilize Christians for collaborative peace building across lines of difference in their communities, whatever that looks like in their context. So it's really an honor to continue doing this program with you, Ola, and excited to hear from Dr. Craig today. And like Ola mentioned, feel free to use the chat to, if you want to just affirm, Dr. Craig as he's talking, or if you have a question, you can feel free to put that in the chat and we'll note it down for later during the question and answer. And then before we start, we're going to hand it over to Mayor, who will give a recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha. And then I will recite the Lord's Prayer.
And also what we're going to do before we formally introduce Dr. Craig Considine, we're doing something a little different. Becca, you want to talk about the polls and then I'll start one?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so we're curious to hear from you all about kind of your knowledge of this topic of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, interactions with Christians during his life. So Ola just started the poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. And you can go ahead and just select what your level of knowledge is.
We're going to make you do some work here.
Some homework.
We'll give a few seconds for everybody to participate. And we're going to have a similar question at the end to see if there was a difference by the time we finish our program. Handful of more people waiting for them to. Okay. All right, I will end the poll now. And I will share the results. So most people have some knowledge and a good amount have no knowledge. So we hope at the end, when we ask our second question at the end of the program, that it will increase to a lot more people having significant amount of knowledge. So now I'll introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Craig Considine. Dr. Craig Considine is the author of a few books. The one that really kind of was the beginning of his becoming very popular was a bestseller, The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. And also the book that we're talking about today, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. And he also has many other books on Islam and Muslims and many articles. Dr. Craig is also a professor of sociology at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Dr. Craig Considine is also a global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual. Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, CBS News, Fox News, MSNBC, excuse me, Newsweek, and Al Jazeera. He's been invited to speak at some of the leading international organizations and universities in the world. Dr. Considine is visible on social media. He holds a PhD from Trinity College, which is University of Dublin, and a master's degree from Royal Holloway University of London, and a BA from American University in Washington, DC, where I think his interest began in talking about and researching Islam and Prophet Muhammad, but he'll let us know. Dr. Considine is a US Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. Welcome, Dr. Craig. So I'm gonna start with a couple of questions. And I wish we were like live somewhere physically together, but I hope the next program we will do it in person and maybe or a hybrid program. We'll see how things go. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions to get hopefully the conversation going and get you all comfortable with also asking some questions yourself. So I'm very interested, and I'm sure our audience is also interested in knowing what incidents in your life led you to become interested in Islam? And can you discuss your background and how you became interested in Islam, especially your focus on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and what made you begin writing books on Islam and Muslims? And of course, now Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians, but really The Humanity of Muhammad, I think, was also a groundbreaking book. And I know writing books is not an easy task. So, and you have a child, so please let us know, what really got you to do this. Thank you.
First of all, Ola, thank you so much for having me to Our Common Beliefs, the great work that you're doing. Thank you so much. Becca, you as well, my fellow American University alum. Thank you so much for organizing this. And it's great to see that y'all have pushed your connection as far as being good enough friends that you can invite each other to, or Ola, that you were invited to Becca's wedding, which is really, that's some of the relationships I'm encouraging people to form. Like, don't just have these kind of surface level friendships, that we actually go deeper and become like family. So my journey, it really started on 9/11, though I didn't I didn't know it at the time. I was 15 growing up outside of Boston, Needham, Massachusetts. As Ola said, from a Catholic family, Irish Italian. I always tell audiences I had absolutely no choice. Irish Italian, had to be Catholic, and had no exposure to Muslims or Islam at all. Not merely in the physical in terms of meeting communities and visiting places of worship, but even in our curriculum, like even in Catholic school and public school. I went to both. There was just like no discussion on Islam at all. And as you can imagine, I'm 15, no exposure to anything, being fed all of this propaganda in the media, and Islamophobia is running rampant. And it's perhaps unsurprising that one would kind of take the bait, the Islamophobia bait, as I often refer to it as. I mean, I was naive, I was ignorant, and had no frame of reference. So I actually went to college to play basketball, and when that career hit a brick wall, I turned my attention and my energy to foreign affairs. 2003, the invasion of Iraq happened. I was a freshman in college, and it caught my attention, not because of Islamophobia per se, but I kind of just knew that something was dodgy, something off was happening, something immoral, and subsequently illegal. So I transferred from Eastern Connecticut University in Willimantic, Connecticut, which is not too far from most of y'all in New York, and I went to American University, and I was really planning on getting into the intelligence realm. I wanted to understand, like, what is Iraq? Like, what are all these narratives happening in the media? What's up with Al-Qaeda? What is this war on terrorism? So I kind of had a security mindset going into my studies. And thank God I had a great professor, Akbar Ahmed, who is still the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University, former ambassador from Pakistan to the UK, a brilliant scholar, anthropologist by training, and someone who really has been a pioneer with interfaith dialogue. When I was his student as an undergrad, Dr. Ahmed initiated an interfaith dialogue with Judea Pearl. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Judea Pearl. He's the father of Daniel Pearl, who is an American journalist for the Wall Street Journal, who was slain in Pakistan. And Dr. Ahmed, reached out to Judea Pearl, and they traveled the country together, a Jewish-Muslim dialogue, getting in front of audiences and basically showing people like, yeah, these hate crimes happen around the world, but here's also two human beings coming together looking to build bridges. So my introduction to Islam, it started with this security thing, and then Dr. Ahmed kind of just ruptured that, and I started seeing this interfaith angle, the interfaith dialogue angle, which really caught my attention because I saw it as a solution. It's part of the solution to a lot of the narratives and the ills that we see in the world. So when I graduated in 2007, I studied in London for a year, and then I came back. I traveled with Dr. Ahmed for over a year. We wrote a book, and he published a book, and we created a documentary together called Journey into America, which you can find online. So this opportunity we started during Ramadan, and it brought me to over 100 mosques across the length and breadth of this beautiful continent, North America, the United States in particular. And, the more people I met, the deeper into interfaith I got, the more passionate I became, and the more hope I saw in interfaith to provide, again, a solution to some of these ills. Now, with Muhammad, my interest in Muhammad actually didn't come for a few years later. That really picked up in 2013 when Professor John Andrew Morrow published his book, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, which is funny. Like, actually, let me show you right now. I always rest my book on my computer on his books as a symbol of my appreciation for the great work that he does. So this book was a complete game changer for me. It was published in 2013, and this was the height of these violent, barbaric clashes between Christians and Muslims around the Middle East. You know, like there were sides slaughtering each other, awful murders, awful killings. And then this book is basically saying, look at all of this evidence that Prophet Muhammad actually engaged with Christians and didn't just engage with them cordially. He actually entered into partnerships with these Christians and allied himself with Christians. So I kind of took it on myself, like these stories need to be shared. This information needs to be shared. And the further I went into my research about Prophet Muhammad, the more I believed in it, you know, the more I saw its contemporary value. And my last two books have been dedicated to showing the side of him that we never see in the media. And I even posted about this recently. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's happening in India at the moment with two BJP Hindu nationalist politicians coming out and saying the kind of typical awful things about Prophet Muhammad. Like we only hear about him when a non-Muslim says something bad about him, or a group of Muslims like take to the streets and engage in violence to defend his honor. We never hear about just like the normal, peaceful bridge building stories. And there's so many of them. So really what I just try to do is bring these stories to the forefront. You know, Prophet Muhammad happens to be Muslim. You know, I'm not sharing these stories because he is Muslim. He just happens to be Muslim. And as a Christian, I see a lot of goodness in his life and his story. And I happen to be a scholar, and I'm supposed to be objective. I'm supposed to be fair. And that's what I'm trying to do in delivering these stories to the public.
We thank you so much for doing that. And we really do. I mean, from the bottom of my heart personally. But I neglected to do something very important, which is to start our program with the recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha and the translation by Brother Amer. I just want to introduce Brother Amer. He's a good friend of my two sons. He's also one of our wonderful reciters at our mosque, and he's also the head of the youth group there. And then after he does that, Becca will share the Lord's Prayer. And then I have a few more questions, and Becca has some questions, and then we're going to be opening it up to everybody. So Brother Amer, please.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. So this translates to, all praise be to Allah, who is the Lord of the universes, who is the most compassionate, the most merciful, who is the owner of the day of judgment. To you, O Allah, we worship, and to you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path on which your blessed people had walked, and not the path that the people who had earned your wrath had walked. Ameen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Amer. And Becca?
Yes, thank you, Mary. I will just be reading from the New Testament in the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 9 to 13. It's called the Lord's Prayer, or Our Father prayer, and it's what Jesus instructed to his disciples of how to pray to the Father God. So, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Dr. Craig, I have another question for you. I think you gave us an idea of how you began, and it seems the professor made a very big impression on you, and I'm sure your students will say the same about you now that you're a professor, that you've made much impressions on them. But I wanted to ask you, how has writing this book affected your knowledge personally and feelings of monotheistic Christianity versus trying, I know you say that and I have a very hard time saying this word, it's a tongue twister for me, Trinitarian Christianity. Can you let us know like what you've discovered when you did this research in the writing of the book? And also as you're talking about this subject, I noticed in your book that you talked about monotheistic Christians that were led by James in Jerusalem, who was one of Prophet Jesus' disciples, and also the priest Arius in Alexandria, Egypt. So they, in your book, what I understood is they were monotheistic Christians. So if you could tell us a little bit of that, and also versus the theology of the Trinity that was developed by Paul, I believe that was later, I'm not sure, you could tell us. I have here, I think Paul was started writing or preaching 300 years after the death of Prophet Jesus. But I think he was outside of the area of Jerusalem. So those are a couple of questions I'd like you to expand on if you could.
Sure. So writing this book, I think for me was most enlightening because it taught me more really about Christianity than it did about Islam. And it taught me about all these different groups of people that Muhammad had engaged it with. And I think it's important to recognize too, like the term Christians in the title of the book, like we should be careful to not treat Christians as a monolith. You know, Muhammad was engaging with Christians to the north, within Mecca, within Medina, and to the west across the Red Sea in Abyssinia. And the Christians to the north, you know, in cities like Busra and Damascus and Jerusalem and Gaza, and perhaps even Petra, like these were, there were many different ideas of what it meant to be Christian. And I think it's really important to recognize the great diversity within the larger Christian population of the area. I do talk a lot in this book about the first couple decades after Jesus's passing. And there's a lot of scholarship that mentions a potential rift between the early Christians. And I framed this, and this is largely based off Mustafa Akil's work. He wrote The Islamic Jesus, which is a great book. And Mustafa kind of points to James of the Jerusalem church being part of the Jewish Christian population, which were Christians in the sense that they believed Jesus was the Messiah, but they also kept to the halakha and to like kind of Jewish law, right? So they wanted to maintain those Jewish practices, but they had a different theological idea of what Jesus came to earth to do. And over time, you know, Paul comes in, his ideas are also spreading amongst the Gentiles, the non-Jewish population. And some scholars, not all, some scholars point to the idea of the Trinity being kind of more linked to Paul. And I think it's important to recognize too, like even Trinitarian Christians, like don't necessarily, like they don't see this as being like three gods. It's just a different way that God manifests itself. It's still monotheistic. It's still a belief of one God. Like I don't know of one Christian that believes in three gods, but different ideas of how God manifests itself, himself or herself, however you want to define God. So for 300 years, there were different debates in Alexandria, in the Holy Land, in different parts of the world, who was Jesus? And it really came to a head in the year 325. Some of you may be familiar with the Council of Nicaea. So we're talking, 320 years or so after Jesus' passing. And this was a groundbreaking moment in history, 325, 2 years before Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to modern day Istanbul, Constantinople. And he also converted to Christianity. So you can imagine how big of a deal that was. The most powerful empire on earth, its leader is basically saying, I'm now Christian. And you may know that the Roman Empire and the Roman authorities in Rome persecuted Christians for hundreds of years. Even going so far as throwing Christians in the ring of the Colosseum and making Christians face off against tigers and lions and just barbaric forms of torture. So Constantine comes in 325, and this is the first time really where the Father, Son, Holy Spirit Trinitarian idea of Christ and Christianity became a official doctrine of the church. And the more traditional monotheistic side that didn't necessarily want to pit God into these three categories, they were essentially the losers of the council. And they were deemed to be heretics. And a lot of this centered around the divinity of Jesus. Was Jesus divine? Was he semi-divine? Was he not divine at all? In the next century, in 431, there was also a very important council that centered on Jesus's divinity, the Council of Ephesus in 431, right? So we're talking over 240 years before Muhammad is even here on earth. And the Council of Ephesus focused on the divinity of Mary, the divinity of Jesus through Mary. Was Mary Christikos or Theotokos? Was she the birth giver of Christ, or was she the birth giver of God? And she ends up being the birth giver of God, which is part of the history after the Council of Nicaea. For the next 200, 300 years, Jesus becomes increasingly divine. So the book goes back into this part of history. You have to understand those councils to understand who the Christians were that Muhammad was interacting with. Essentially, the losers, the heretics of these councils, I pose it in the book, are some of the Christians that Muhammad engaged with in his travels. But also, it's important to recognize, for instance, the Christians of Abyssinia, who I'm sure we're going to talk about, and the Christians of Najran. According to my research, they actually weren't part of this kind of Christian Jerusalem church. They were actually Trinitarians. So Muhammad was engaging with more monotheistic Christians, more Trinitarian Christians. And we know that he had cordial relations with both. And I think there's a kind of misperception that Muhammad was only engaging with, the kind of older Christians, the pure monotheistic Christians, and that's not true. Like the Christians of Najran, I see no evidence pointing to the idea that they were monotheists. They were of course monotheists, but this stricter monotheism. So there's a lot of different angles that we need to consider, and really, to understand Muhammad's encounters with Christians, you have to go back to Christian theology, to all of these different councils.
So fascinating, actually, for me when I read this, and now you're making it even more clear. There was three Christians you mentioned that were monotheists, like you were just saying, who were now, I guess, labeled heretics at that time. Maybe that Prophet Muhammad encountered. One of them is they're all, I think, I'm not sure, but I know one of them and is definitely highlighted and mentioned in the Quran heavily. So I'm not an expert. So I might be wrong. Maybe there is a couple other that are the other two that are mentioned that might be. I think one of them is, but I'm not sure. But you talked about Bahira, Waraka ibn Nawfal, which is the one that I know for sure is mentioned several times in the Quran, Waraka ibn Nawfal, and Nestor. So can you tell us a little bit about them and like what surprised you or resonated with you the most when you were researching them?
Yes. Ola, give me 1 second. I locked the door and my wife is at the door. I'm sorry for doing this. It's unprofessional. Okay. Just give me a second. Hold on.
Okay, that's okay. I think
that's life.
This Zoom world. But it's very interesting so far in the conversation to understand that there was a difference.
I apologize for that, everyone.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, the book actually starts with Bahira, the monk. And the way I frame this, I kind of point to him being a Nestorian. And the Nestorians were essentially the sect that lost out in 431 at the Council of Ephesus. And we have to remember too the geopolitical kind of situation at the time. So like Syria, much of Turkey, Jerusalem, Gaza, a significant part of Jordan, like it was under the control of the Byzantine Empire. And again, the Byzantine Empire founded in 325 with Constantine, and this is when the Trinity became official doctrine. So some scholars say that after the Council of Nicaea and Council of Ephesus, the Byzantine Empire is kind of pushing out the Christians that they don't really want to be part of the empire. You know, they're heretics, and we see this happening today. And they push them further and further to the periphery. You know, and at the time, the periphery of the Byzantine Empire, you know, it never hit Medina, it never hit Mecca. With Bahira, so Bahira is said to have met Muhammad when Muhammad was just a small boy. You know, I put in the book, I think it's like 582. So Muhammad was quite young, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story. Bahira essentially predicts the greatness of Muhammad, that he's going to be a prophet, and so on and so forth. So that's quite significant in itself. I mean, one of the first recorded stories of Muhammad's interactions with Christians is with this kind of more stringent monotheist who predicts his prophethood. So that's significant in its own right. And I also talk in the book, especially in the first chapter, you know, Muhammad, the young boy, you know, so we know 582, he's under the care of Abu Talib, but really right up into his young adulthood, you know, even to his 40s, like he was under the watch per se of Khadija. He was working for Khadija. And this entire region of the world was, I think, not as remote as people like to think it is, you know, like this kind of like backwoods, like desert place that was like disconnected from the world. That's just, I don't think that's historically accurate. You know, cities like Busra, cities like Jerusalem, which Muhammad very likely had entered, these were bustling, cosmopolitan, diverse places. You know, Muhammad was hearing different languages, meeting with different people, and to be a successful businessman, which we know he was, you must have these type of kind of business skills and these social skills to succeed. So I imagine Muhammad had met a lot of Christians. Like we only know of Bahira in 582. That's kind of the first recorded one, but I'm sure there were previous encounters as well. So Waraka, I think, is quite interesting as well. Of course, 610. Muhammad knew Waraka well before 610, the event in Mount Hira, the beginning of the Quran, as we know, because Waraka was essentially like first cousins with Khadija. And when Muhammad and Khadija married in 595, I'm pretty sure Waraka would have been at that wedding. And Waraka is said to have been someone who could read scripture, Hebrew scripture. Some point to him being kind of part of that James Church of Jerusalem, that more stringent, we're focusing on Jewish law, yet we still believe Jesus is the Messiah, but they're kind of not really buying into the Trinitarian thing. So Warwick may have been part of this kind of, let's say, more, one could say it's a more conservative outlook of Christianity, but others would say it was the heretical branch of Christianity because they didn't buy into the Trinity. And we also know, according to Islamic sources, that Warwick basically foretold Muhammad's future as like a kind of prophet, like Moses, almost like he's bringing the law, he's bringing a new law for the people. So some of the most important moments in Muhammad's life, as a young man, as an orphan in 582, he's just starting his travels around the region. He's in Busra, which is in Syria. He meets a Christian, favorable encounter. And of course, Warqa in 610, think about the relationship that they probably had. And I often wonder how much did they previously talk about faith, about religion, about God, about Jesus. And when Muhammad comes down from the cave on Mount Hira in 610, he goes to Khadija, and then the first person they go to is a Christian. And Warqa is also saying, everything that you just experienced there, that's all legitimate. It's part of this bigger kind of project, which is religion and God. So fascinating. Fascinating stuff. And, we'll never know who Bahira really was. Well, I don't think we'll ever know who Warqa really was either, but we have some theories. And again, to understand their identities, you have to go back into Christian history, into Christology, and figure out where Christians deliberated over Jesus, and also how the Byzantine Empire treated Christians that were deemed to be heretics.
So much information that it's really very, I find it really fascinating. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to ask Becca if she has any questions. And there have been questions that were submitted actually when people registered, so I want to honor that, and I'll honor those. And then we have a few in the chat. So you had mentioned the Negus, the Christian king of Abyssinia, which is present-day Ethiopia, and that he's very well known in Islamic history for his kindness and fairness, and how he protected the new Muslims that escaped persecution in Mecca from the Quraysh. Can you tell us what intrigued you the most about this historic story?
Yeah, what a great story. One that I think should resonate with people today, because the Muslims of Mecca, being fiercely persecuted, so persecuted that Muhammad was literally afraid that the message and the movement would die, because everyone could be potentially killed in Mecca. So he was like, you got to go spread this message somewhere else, make sure it's safe somewhere else. So imagine they're packing their bags. They're told to leave all their comfort, their homes, their friends, the place that they always called home. They go across modern day Saudi Arabia. They get to a port, and then they're just looking at the Red Sea, and they're expected to cross the Red Sea. And Muhammad tells them when they get across the Red Sea, there will be a Christian king there to protect you. That's a huge leap of faith, a huge leap of faith. And that happens a lot today with the various refugee crises that we see in the world. So, that alone moves me, because it shows that these refugees really trusted what Muhammad was saying, that they would be protected. But it also shows that these refugees really believed in the movement, because they were willing to risk their life. And in Abyssinia, there are a couple of moments, I think, that really stand out in the sources. And this is really well documented in the famous movie. I think it's called The Messenger, which is available on YouTube, a great movie about Prophet Muhammad's life. I think it was in the late 70s, 1970s. And so what strikes me the most about this is that the King Ibn Abjar, who I write in the book was actually a Trinitarian, he not only allowed the Muslims refuge, he not only gave them asylum, but he actively defended them when the Quraysh were trying to ask him to send the Muslims back to the Quraysh, and then they would ultimately go back to Mecca where they would probably die. Right. So what King Ibn Abjar did was, it was beyond this kind of superficial allyship, which is like, yeah, like you can come here, we'll protect you, but if things don't go right, or if the situation for me might spiral out of control and it may not be of benefit to me anymore, you would imagine politicians do this all the time. They just go against their word. But we have evidence that suggests, like, in the court of King Ibn Abjar, the Quraysh and the Muslims were both there. And King Ibn Abjar literally kind of looked at the Quraysh. You can imagine him like pointing at them and holding his ground, being very firm and saying, and he said this according to the sources, not for a mountain of gold would I give these people up to you. And he's like, go home. And he points to the Muslims and say, hey, you're safe here. So it's not just about bigger picture here. Like, it's not just about giving people refuge. That should be the bare minimum. But it's actively engaging in a defense of a people. And I talk in the book about the modern use of the concept of allyship. A lot of young people are always talking about how do we be allies, to be a good ally. Yeah. I mean, open your communities, open your cities and your towns and your homes and your places of worship for refugees or the destitute. But there might come a time where you have to put your own well-being on the line for people. Like, are you willing to do that? And King Ibn Abjar, he definitely did that, So I find that to be a very inspiring story for Christians. Like, that to me is the real proper example of Jesus. It's not just saying, we're all about the periphery. We're all about welcoming people in that are on the margins of society, but it's actively defending these people. And I think that's very inspiring.
It's noted in Islamic sources that when the Negus spoke and asked questions to the Muslims that were coming in about Islam, and he said, this sounds practically the same as Christianity. And then he made a line with a stick in the sand. He says, that's the difference.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And I write about that. Yeah. I mean, that's like it's a huge part of the story. And there's another great quote, Ola. It's like the King Ibn Abjar, they said he wept until the scrolls of his scholars were wet, because the verses from the Quran, which were praising Jesus and Mary, were music to their ears, because it's really, and it's fascinating. I mean, for those that may not be familiar with this, like, if you read the Quranic perspective on Mary, it lines up almost identically to the biblical position. I mean, even up into Angel Gabriel visiting and a miraculous birth and her virtue and her modesty and all these things. I mean, it's amazing. I would have loved to be there. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that little episode in his court in Abyssinia.
Yes, I mean, the Virgin Mary has the only chapter named after. She's the only woman that has a chapter named after in the Quran. Chapter 19, Maryam, and there's another chapter about her family, the family of Imran, just chapter 3 of it. So yeah, so much information about Prophet Jesus and the Virgin Mary, peace be upon them all, is in the Quran in a beautiful way. And also Prophet Moses is talked about in a tremendous amount.
And if I can add too, Ola, like one of the things that really struck me the most in writing this book was the relationship that Prophet Muhammad had with Angel Gabriel. Angel Gabriel is very significant in the Christian tradition, primarily because, he visited many people, but he is said to have introduced the fate of Mary, and we know in 610, when the Quran began, it was Angel Gabriel visiting Prophet Muhammad. We know that Angel Gabriel was there at the Battle of Badr. We know that Angel Gabriel is said to have basically saved Muhammad from an assassination attempt from his enemies. We know that Angel Gabriel was guiding Prophet Muhammad on the night journey to Jerusalem, like all of these different stories with just Gabriel. So Gabriel, like we give so much attention to Jesus and Mary as a link between Christianity and Islam, and rightly so. But Gabriel's like the forgotten person. And he was there in some of Muhammad's most important life events.
Actually, one of the presentations I do is about the angels, and I talk about angel Gabriel, and angel Michael extensively in that, which, to me, I'm sure that there's angels where everybody is on this call with us today because we're doing good work. So, Becca, would you like to ask some questions and then we'll open it up to everyone?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, Dr. Craig, I love what you were sharing about kind of, this historical example of like, what does embodied like allyship or solidarity look like? And it just made me think of that example I think it was in Egypt, like several years ago, where there was a group of Muslims like physically surrounding Christians, and like those examples are just always so powerful. So thank you for everything that you're sharing so far. And I actually personally don't have any like burning questions. So I know there's a question that Rabbi Mike had put in the chat about, he said he was curious if like Prophet Muhammad's interactions with Christians are recorded in the Quran and the Hadiths, but I guess you kind of touched on that already. But
Well, so
yeah.
My book, people of the book, as I'm explaining these stories, what I try to do is give a glimpse into the Quran, because as we know, the Quran was like, it was like a live stream, like it was revealed during his life and it was being recorded then. And a lot of these stories with like the Christians of Abyssinia or the Christians of Najran, there are scholars who have basically said, okay, it's likely that this verse of the Quran happened at this moment in Islamic history. And my book doesn't really dive into that, but I'll tell you which book does, for our rabbi friend. It's by Juan Cole, and it's called The Prophet of Peace. And this book, Juan Cole is a historian, and he basically explains Islamic history through the prism of the Quran, and he lines everything up. So the Quran does indeed mention it, and I'll give you one example.
Can I spell this correctly on the chat?
Let me see. Juan Cole. Sorry, my lights keep going out here. I'm sure you're seeing Prophet of Peace, Juan Cole. That's correct. So the one example that I think sticks out to me is there's a story in the Quran. I can't remember the verse at the moment, but it refers to a group of Christians being essentially like thrown into like pits of fire. And Juan Cole points to this being linked to the history of the Christians of Najran, which I turn to at the end of my book. So Najran is a city on the border of modern day Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And the Christians of Najran, in the centuries before Prophet Muhammad's life began in 570, they were amidst a long struggle with the Jewish Himyarite tribe of the southern Arabian Peninsula in modern day Yemen. And things obviously got so out of control that the Christians were being fiercely persecuted, and they are said to have been thrown into these pits of fire. And many scholars actually say that these are the Christians of Najran. And we know in 630, towards the end of Prophet Muhammad's life, we have another great example of Christian Muslim, not merely coexistence, but like embrace. And this is when Prophet Muhammad welcomed the Christians of Najran into his masjid. They had a long dialogue, and it said that Prophet Muhammad even allowed the Christians of Najran to pray inside the mosque. And let me say too, like, this is important because if you go back into the history of the Najranites, they were very likely adherents to the Council of Nicaea, which means, again, the Trinitarian. So like even Muhammad wasn't even distinguishing between this kind of more conservative Jerusalem church coming from James monotheism and like the Paul Trinitarian version. He was engaging with both. So he wasn't saying, okay, well, these are the good Christians and these are the heretical Christians. He wasn't even doing that, according to my research.
Can you share a little bit about Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, development of the Muslim civic nation? Because
Yes.
most people have no idea that he did this, or don't
Yeah.
really, have a historical context to that.
Yeah, so usually when Western scholars or Westerners, if I could put it crudely, when they talk about the foundation of America with the Constitution, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to own property, and all this stuff, a lot of people point back to the Magna Carta, King John in the 12th century, I believe, as one of the kind of foundational documents that led to like a people's movement, that the people would have a say in how they were governed. But really, that's a very kind of Western-centric position. Back in 622, we have Prophet Muhammad entering what is commonly referred to as either the Medina Charter or the Constitution of Medina. And to give you a little backdrop, at the time, Medina is, of course, it's north of Mecca. And prior to Prophet Muhammad's arrival there, you had a conglomeration of groups of people. So predominantly pagan tribes, Jewish tribes. And you also had an assortment of Christians, which often gets overlooked too. But these tribes, Jews, pagans, were fighting each other. Jews were fighting amongst Jews. Pagans were fighting amongst pagans. And it was just a real mess. And they invited a council of elders from Medina, invited Prophet Muhammad to basically take over Medina, but not like forcefully. They invited him to serve as a mediator, basically as a judge, like a justice, a leader, a president, essentially. And I like to imagine Muhammad's kind of entrance into Medina. Like, what was the first thing that he did when engaging with these groups? And he probably brought everyone to the table, all of these different tribes, and he's like, okay, so like, what's going on? What are your grievances? What are the issues that need to be clarified? And so on and so forth. And out of this council was the Constitution of Medina, which is readily available via Google search. It's also an appendix in the book. And really, this was an exceptional document. I refer to it as leading to a civic nation. A civic nation is basically one in which anyone can be an equal member. Your place in society in a civic nation is not determined by your parents' race, your genes, religion, or your ethnic background. What makes you part of the civic nation is a constitutional right. And the Constitution of Medina has many articles. Some of these articles are saying, the Jews have freedom of religion. The state will not interfere in the religious affairs of all of these different groups. So it gave people, these tribes, like their space. It gave them their freedom. It gave them their sovereignty. And if you look at some of the founding principles of this country, at least when we look at the Constitution, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to own property, the right to vote, a lot of these things have been theoretical throughout history, but at least in print, these are the things that were also available in the Constitution of Medina. So when people talk about, this big clash between the West and Islam, like, the Islamic world is like anti-democratic and all this stuff. I mean, you just have one simple example, the Constitution of Medina. It kind of overturns all of that stuff. But let me remind you too, and I'll make a link back to the Christians of Abyssinia. King Ibn Abjar welcomed the Muslims into his state, provided them refuge, but more importantly, he defended them. He was willing to put his empire on the line to promote freedom of religion. And the Constitution of Medina, it's very explicit in its articles, especially towards the end of the Constitution, where it basically says, like, if a Jewish tribe is attacked or if a pagan tribe is attacked, it's upon the Muslims to defend these groups. If a pagan group is attacked, the Jews have to go support the pagans and the Muslims have to go support the pagans. So it created a confederation. So basically, your well-being is dependent on my well-being. We're a confederation, we're a republic. It's the same thing that happens in this country with our states. Like, God forbid, this would probably never happen, but if Canada invaded Washington state, Like Wyoming and Massachusetts and Florida and Texas would have to like jump on board. And that's what Muhammad was creating at the time, a mutually dependent confederation of a diverse group of people. And their sense of belonging to this city of Medina was not predicated on the color of their skin or their religious beliefs. It was predicated on the rule of law. And that's important.
So fascinating that this was done in the 600s.
622, yeah. It's
that
crazy.
Prophet Muhammad had this, amazing vision to live in cooperation with everybody around him. And so to me, as the more I read, the more I learn too. So, and of course, reading your book enlightens me in so many ways. So one of the things that I really learned reading your book that I really had no idea about before was that I didn't know that there was a Coptic Christian carpenter who built the roof of the Kaaba in 605 AD. And I didn't know that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is mentioned in the United States Supreme Court as one of the 16 greatest lawgivers in history, as well as Prophet Moses, peace be upon him. Please give us your reflections on those two things, especially the second one. Yeah, both of them, please.
So I'm just touching on, at least thus far, Bahira the monk, Waraka, the Christians of Abyssinia, and the Christians of Najran. Like these are like the big stories. But the book itself, like what I tried to do basically is to share every little piece of information that exists on Muhammad's encounters with Christians. So there's a lot of kind of smaller stories, like Ola, you mentioned, that it's likely that parts of the Kaaba in Mecca were part of a Christian ship that had shipwrecked somewhere along the Red Sea. And then the carpenter that went and got those materials brought it back to the Kaaba, and it was part of one of the previous, installations of the Kaaba. The book has so many stories like that. One that also sticks out is Salman al-Farsi, who was one of Muhammad's closer companions. He is said to have been a Christian. He later converted and was a quintessential figure in one of the most significant battles of the early Muslim community, the Battle of the Trench. So the book is just packed with all these little tidbits. But
he's Iranian, and he had, and I guess where he lived, they knew how to make these trenches, and this was new to Prophet Muhammad's area for people there, and he came up with that idea. So that was one of very, very famous for that.
Yeah, and he was said to have learned the craft of building a trench because he was enslaved as well. So there's all sorts of interesting stories. Another one to bring up is Bilal ibn Rabah, who I actually focus more on in my previous book, The Humanity of Muhammad. But Muhammad's mother was perhaps linked to some degree with Christianity because she was from Abyssinia, and Abyssinia was a Christian kingdom. So like you can just imagine, like the just everyday conversations people were having with faith. Like, what did Bilal ibn Rabah and his mother and various family members and other members of the community, like what did they hear about Christianity? And like how did that inform the development of the early movement? But the Supreme Court example, again, I mean, talk about one easy example to use to bust that clash of civilizations theory out the window. This idea that the Islamic world and the Western world, these big kind of conglomerates, which we know are a lot more diverse than people like to think, like they're somehow on a crash course, and they always have been and they always will be. But this is a great story. It was under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, like 1932. So we're talking like pre-World War II. And Roosevelt's administration wanted to pay homage to the United States's emphasis, or let's say ideal, with justice. And obviously we know we've struggled with implementing that justice throughout history, but this is an ideal. And he hired a German architect named Weichmann was the last name. And long story short, they came up with 14 prophets throughout history that were great lawgivers to their people. So we had like Hammurabi, Confucius, Napoleon, a couple of ancient Greek philosophers. I'm forgetting their names, and Prophet Muhammad was one. And this is in the U.S. Supreme Court chamber. And unfortunately, there was a little dispute. I think it was like the late 1990s. A couple of groups who happened to be like kind of linked to the Islamic faith, like they were upset that there was an actual physical depiction of Muhammad in the court. Obviously, we know that that's frowned upon in the Islamic tradition, if I could speak of it broadly. But it shows him with like a sword and like a book, which is probably the Quran. But I think that's, from a personal perspective, like I'm like, you're kind of missing the bigger picture. Everything can't go according to your desire all the time. Like we still have a massive tribute to one of the greatest and most significant human beings to ever live, in arguably a top 5 most important building in this country, and it's there to honor him. So I've yet to see it. I would love to see it. And there's so many other examples like of these great bridge building events between the so-called Muslim world and the United States throughout history. And I've written about that in previous books too.
One thing you mentioned in your book was the document that was authored by Pope Francis and Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib of the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, called The Document of Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a groundbreaking document. Of course, it's coming from the Vatican and Al-Azhar, two of the most prestigious, most important and influential religious political institutions in the world. And it was signed in Abu Dhabi in the UAE in the year of tolerance in the UAE. And you got to read the document itself. It's really it's more than just a treaty. It's laying out a philosophy on how we can be as humans and how we can interact with one another as humans. And it stands for basic principles that are linked to the civic nation. Like people should be free to worship. They should have freedom of religion. They should be able to live in safety and protection. That they should live in a society and an environment that can fulfill them, that can enrich them. So it's an elaborate document. It's not too long, but it lays out a future and a direction for Christians and Muslims. And it also does a decent amount in basically condemning extremism and basically saying, these forms of extremism, whether it's ISIS or white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, is antithetical to our faith traditions. And this is building off of what Pope Francis has been referring to since the beginning of his papacy, which is the culture of encounter, which he has outlined in detail. And it's actually in the introduction of this book, People of the Book, Pope Francis is telling Christians, but you can surmise he's telling all of humanity. It's like, it's not just about meeting people out in the public. It's not just about, hosting events. It's forging deeper relationships with people, right? So it's not just, you're going to listen to someone. You're going to listen with the intention of hearing and understanding, right? So it's really pushing us to move beyond tolerance, a deeper understanding of who we are as Christians, as Muslims, and as human beings. And he also mentions the need to transcend the culture of indifference. That's what he refers to it as, the culture of indifference, basically the opposite of what King Ibn Abjar did in 615. The culture of indifference, this idea that, there's a refugee crisis happening in that part of the world, or this mosque in Tennessee was burnt, torched to the ground by a group of white supremacists, or, something happening in Nigeria in a church. Like, a lot of people are just like, oh yeah, like that happens. And Pope Francis is like, that culture, like that tradition that we've developed of being apathetic to the plight of our fellow human beings is part of the problem. And the antidote to that is actually to forge more humane relationships with people. Like, let's get to know people so we can understand them on a deeper level.
So that kind of goes into the question with one of the people in the chat, or one of our registrants, Layla Lasri. She said, asked, Christians were supportive of the early Muslim community. The Silk Road brought people of many faiths together to engage in commerce. In today's world, how can the Muslim community in the USA engage with Christian communities in the Midwest, where they are isolated from Muslims? Our Muslim communities ready to reach out, but lack entree, into these communities.
I honestly think the best way of bringing these groups together in some of these spots where there's not a lot of interaction is to not even focus on religion at all at first. I often I'm saying this increasingly to audiences that are interested in starting interfaith dialogue. I'm like, the first thing you need to do is just bring people together and talk about, what it's like to be, a human, a dad, a son, an employee, a citizen of a country. Like, leave the religion outside for now. It's too loaded. There's too many misperceptions and misconceptions, and it often just leads to a brick wall. Like, to properly engage in authentic and fruitful conversations on religion, you have to trust one another first. And that doesn't just happen like that. That takes time. Not all the friends that you meet in your life are friends instantly. Some are, and that's great. Some develop over time because it builds trust, it builds rapport. So I would encourage Christians and Muslims around the country to start at a more human level, bring people together over food. Try not to bring in heavy conversations on theology or Quranic passages or biblical passages. And I also think that there's a lot of hope in this country to use the civic space, the public sphere. You don't need to be religious you don't need to be Christian or Muslim to fight poverty or to build a school, right? So we can have Christians and Muslims coming together because in this country, you can use the public space, you can come together, you can have a rally, you can have a gathering, you can have a charitable event. The Constitution allows these things to happen. So you use that to your advantage, use that public space and do things for the wider community. It doesn't have to be just for the Muslim community or the Christian community. How about Christians and Muslims come together and do something for a completely different group of people? Jewish people, for instance, something like that. Now, I'll give you an example, a modern example of pluralism, this moving beyond religious tolerance. It's happening in Berlin. It's called the House of One. And this is being inspired by the work of a rabbi, a priest, and an imam. And under one roof, this building is being built at the moment. Under one roof, there's going to be a church, a mosque, and a synagogue. Mm-hmm. Separate, though. They're separate, right? So each community has their own space to do their thing according to their will and their tradition and their conscience. But there's a space in between the three places of worship that they all share. It's that common space that, no one has any pure jurisdiction over, that it's there to bring people together, to work together, to have conversations together, to perhaps deal with difficult things together. So I think this kind of balance between the sacred sphere, but also the use of the public sphere is critically important to build these bigger and stronger bridges.
There's another, I totally agree with everything you say. I think getting to know people on a human level, saying hello, being friendly to your neighbors, having, invite people, your neighbors to your, just in your neighborhood, to barbecues, to breaking bread. Obviously, hopefully we can start doing that kind of thing now after COVID, but really just starting with your neighbors is so important. And
nothing,
to get to know people.
Ola, it's so true. And it sounds so simple. And people are like, oh, that's not the solution. Nothing grand can happen unless you start doing those little things. I feel like we live in an instant gratification culture where people just want that. They just want things to be fixed, but they're not willing to put in the work to fix things. Yes. And it really starts first and foremost within ourselves. Are you willing to even go next door and have a conversation with your Muslim friend or your Christian friend? It really starts It starts there. It's a, what do we call it? A bottom up approach, like stop asking politicians and community leaders to fix things. Like that's part of it, but it starts, it's like power to the people, like if we can transform ourselves first, then that will organically seep into the democratic process. And then we have proper leaders leading for the benefit of all and not just certain groups.
There's one other question in the chat, and then anybody who has questions, please, you could use the reaction button on the bottom of your screen. It says reactions, and there's a thing there that you could raise your hand. The question that's in the chat is from Arauya. She states the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, had a copy of the Quran in his library. Actually, it's a book called The Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Please give us your reflection on how far was Jefferson influenced by the Constitution of Medina in writing the American Constitution?
It's a great question. It's been studied in detail by an author who I mentioned earlier, John Andrew Morrow.
What is his name? John Andrew?
John Andrew Morrow, Morrow. And the book is, hang on a second. Let me go get the book. Hold on. This is the book. It's the Islamic Interfaith Initiative. It's a great book, and he dedicates a whole chapter to Thomas Jefferson's library, not just the Quran, but the entirety of his library that has books and information linked to Islam. And John basically unpacks it and says that Thomas Jefferson knew of the Constitution of Medina. He probably had read about that. He probably had read about the covenants of that he entered with the Christians of his time. Let me get you the exact chapter.
Yeah, I saw when I was in DC at the last prayer breakfast, the National Prayer Breakfast, I went to and saw his library, the Thomas Jefferson Library. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
It is, yeah. So the chapter that John wrote, Thomas Jefferson and the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad. Let me see if I can read something real quick. Okay, so he says, listen to this. He says, this is page 200. The founding fathers were familiar with Islam. They were familiar with the Quran, and they also appear to have been familiar with the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad that was published by Gabriel Sionita in Paris in 630 under the name of, it's a Latin name. This book was in Thomas Jefferson's library, right? So this whole chapter that John actually put together uses the books in Jefferson's library to make these kind of potential linkages. Like, if he read this book, then he probably heard about the Constitution of Medina or the treaty that he entered with the Christians of Najran in 630, who left Medina with basically a compact with the Prophet Muhammad. So I think Jefferson was most influenced by the civic republican feature that came out of Medina in 622. But also remember, at the time, 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was doing a relatively good job with freedom of religion, given the historical context. It was relatively progressive for its time. And I imagine Jefferson was also influenced by the ability for the Ottoman Empire to provide different Christian communities within its empire sovereignty. Even Benjamin Franklin, like it moves beyond just Thomas Jefferson. There are primary documents that note a quote from Benjamin Franklin in which he says, and he said this after a big project in Philadelphia. They were what do you call someone from Philadelphia? A Philadelphian? No offense to my fellow.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, a Philadelphian. So like there was a public project, like a civic sphere project, and people from all walks of life were coming together, and they wanted to build a building that was like for the public. It wasn't just for one religion. And when Franklin was trying to garner interest in this project, he said, like, even if the Mufti of Constantinople wanted to come to Philadelphia and preach, he will have a space to do so. And again, this is the most important empire in the 18th century. I mean, the United States was barely even a country, and the Ottoman Empire was a huge global player in the world. So they were absolutely influenced. I mean, it's a great book is by Denise Spellberg. She wrote, I forget the name of the book, but Denise Spellberg, she's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And the concept that she used, the theory that she used is that the founding fathers imagined Muslims as future citizens. And again, the primary documents suggest that even folks like George Washington, in letters to his peers, saying like, you know, Muslims are welcome here. Like, this is not a Christian nation. This is a republic, and we are for freedom of religion.
Does anyone else have questions? Feel free to raise your hand or
Did we lose Ola?
I think she'll be back in a couple minutes. I see Rabbi Mike, you have a question. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. Are you aware of similar work about the prophet's interaction with Jews that were living in the time?
Well, we have the big one, of course, is the Constitution of Medina, which, you know, I didn't get into the development and the trajectory of that, but Rabbi Mike, you might be familiar, and some of our other folks in the audience here might be familiar with it. Things kind of went sour within years after the Constitution, but like that initial spark of coming together, I think should still inspire us, you know, that vision of a confederation, of a republic. And I think we also need to be clear too in not placing too much emphasis on religion when we talk about why things disintegrated. You know, I think a lot of the times people will say, well, you know, it's the differences between Jewish philosophy or theology and Islamic philosophy and theology. And this is why things went sour. It was really a political thing. It was about allegiances and people feeling like they were being mistreated and you know, so on and so forth. But in regards to like his individual encounters with, you know, people like Bahira or Waraka, that's a good question. I'll add one of my favorite stories that Professor Akbar Ahmed at American University was very keen on introducing in his classes quite early in the semester. There's a hadith, and a hadith is a saying or a quote attributed to Prophet Muhammad. And Rabbi Mike, are you familiar with the story with the Jewish funeral procession?
Not sure.
Okay, so Prophet Muhammad is in Medina. Some of his companions are around him, and they are said to have been kind of sitting on a curb of the street. And down the road, there was a big procession coming forward. And Muhammad knew quickly that it was a funeral procession. And somehow he was able to see something and come up with the assumption that these people are Jewish. So the funeral procession is coming down the street, and Muhammad stands up. And one of his companions, and again, the hadith relate this, one of his companions is like, what are you doing? Like this is a Jewish person. And Muhammad turned to this person and said, well, this is a human life. This is a human soul. And I think just little stories like that, like that's like a big picture, essential way of looking at a religion like Islam. But I think it really speaks volume about what Islam is ultimately about, which is like life. It's like human dignity. And all of these other unfortunate stories that that unfolded in the years after the Constitution of Medina, like they were politically driven. It was empires getting involved and people backstabbing each other and all that stuff. Unfortunately, it clouds the way people see Jewish and Muslim relations today. But I encourage all of us today to remember those bright moments in time that we can build on, that can inspire future generations and give hope to future generations that, yeah, coexistence is possible, but there's even something beyond coexistence that we can like flourish together.
I also love to point out that particularly in Spain in the Golden Age, that Judaism was heavily influenced by Muslim philosophers and really changed Jewish theology and philosophy to this day.
Yes, it is. How do you pronounce the name, Rabbi? Maimonides.
Maimonides.
Maimonides. So
Mhm.
Maimonides was arguably one of the most important people in his time in Andalusia. And even today, I think he has a square dedicated to him in Cordoba, the city of Cordoba. And I know there's a statue of him.
Mhm.
And he was part of that civic culture, like I forget what position he had, but he was close to the emperor.
Yeah, he was a physician to the
Yeah.
emperor. And he also, his seminal theological work, Guide to the Perplexed, was
Yes.
written in Arabic.
Yes.
And basically he was responding to the challenge of Muslim philosophers and theology, and was challenged to come up with a Jewish theology.
Brilliant.
And to that point, Jews were not particularly interested in theology. They were more interested in Jewish law and how to live your life rather than putting it all together. And it was really under the influence of Islam that that developed.
And that's beautiful, and I that gives me hope. And again, he couldn't have done that if there wasn't an environment that encouraged people to seek knowledge, regardless of where it's from. And I love to see the kind of exchange, the back and forth. So Islam is saying that, well, then how does that impact Judaism? Christianity saying that, well, how does that happen? Those are the kind of back and forth things that we need.
My teacher, Ruvain Firestone, who was a scholar in Islam, and he was my thesis advisor.
Oh, wow.
He pointed out that in Spain was as far away from headquarters for both Judaism and Islam as you could get and still be, in the world. So they had the maximum freedom to interact and develop without being worried about being harassed by, central command.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. They were maybe like the heretics of their day almost, on the periphery.
Well, at least open-minded and free-thinking. And
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. Based on your research, did Muhammad introduce a system of equality among Muslims and non-Muslims? And was there any level of inequality between the two groups?
Well, I think the Constitution of Medina is a testament to how he thought about equality in terms of governance and law. People were equal before the head of state. Like they were, freedom of religion was granted, the right to own property, the right to have your voice heard, the right to basically participate in governance. All of that was granted. And then, of course, we have in 632 with the farewell sermon, one of Muhammad's last messages to his people. Not a very long speech, but one that packs a big punch. And there's a very famous passage within that farewell sermon, and I'll paraphrase it. He's basically saying, we're all from Adam and Eve. We're all human beings. A black person has no superiority over a white person. An Arab person has no superiority over a white. A white has no superiority over an Arab, except in piety and good action. And I love this story because, again, it links to another single story, which can easily bust this kind of clash of civilization. So we had the 615, the Christians of Abyssinia, 622, Constitution of Medina. We have the Prophet Muhammad in the U.S. Supreme Court. And then we have the farewell sermon linked to Dr. King in 1963. And when I was in DC in early December, I went to the Lincoln Memorial. I stood right where Dr. King gave his speech. There's a very small little plaque. It says, I have a dream speech, Martin Luther King, and the date. And Dr. King, and I'm sure everyone's aware of this, he said, I hope one day my children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And again, 1963 versus 632. I mean, that's a long way apart. And you have Prophet Muhammad, he's an Arab, he's from a particular tribe, he's identifying himself as Muslim, he's Middle Eastern, if you want to throw that term. And then we have an African American, a Christian, a US citizen, a preacher, basically saying the same thing, just at a different continent in the world and in a different era. And these type of stories give me hope. They point to an area of confluence where our values, or our perceived values of our religion and our nation, kind of can cross over and blend together to a point where you can't really determine, like, is this an American value or an Islamic value? It doesn't have to be this or that. It can be both at the same time. And I think that gray area, that zone of synthesis is really critically important. And we need to continue focusing on these things. And I didn't even mention what Prophet Muhammad did for women. I haven't touched upon that. I don't really dive too much into that in People of the Book, because I dedicated a whole chapter in the humanity of Muhammad to it. But, there's a lot of controversy today over Prophet Muhammad's approach to women. But I mean, people just even a rudimentary understanding would realize that he was way ahead of his time for what he was saying about the place of women in society. Like, if he was here today, many people would be like, this is like a hardcore feminist. Like, this guy is talking about what, like he was really pushing people forward, even ending things like female infanticide. I mean, can you imagine, like little girls being born and people looking at them being like, this life has absolutely no value to our well-being. If anything, it's going to be a drain on our family. And people were just like, that's how the ancient Spartans did it. If a baby was born with a deformity, they would toss it. And he ended that. And he even gave basic rights to women, allowing them to divorce, own property. And we know Khadijah was a strong woman, and some of the other significant women in his life went on to do incredible things. So he did a lot for women, and we didn't even touch upon that.
Most of his stories that are related come down from his second wife, Aisha.
Right.
And she, is one of the main scholars who writes about his life, and is all that information is from her, come down through many chains. Yes, I actually have a whole presentation about women in Islam, because most people have no idea. And I talk about the previous history of women in the world, and the amazing rights that that he gave to women such a long time ago. And actually, most Muslim women don't know themselves their own rights, and that's something where education is so important in the world, in every way. So I dedicated a whole presentation, about that. But you did talk about the Christians of Najran, but you mentioned that, and you kind of have a whole appendices about that. So can you just tell us a little bit more, because it's such an important part of history, and how he invited them, and it was such a gracious thing, and it kind of relates to one of the leaders, the Caliph Omar, how he was so pious when he came into Jerusalem and kind of took over Jerusalem, and the head of Jerusalem at that time couldn't believe, you're not going to kill us all. You're not going to be mean to us. You're not going to do this. You're not going to do that. And it was just he came in with his camel, which usually if you're going to come, you're going to come with horses, but he came with his raggy clothes with a camel. So I would like to correlate both stories.
So the Christians of Najran, there's a whole chapter on this in the book, but let me go back to the centuries previous to their visit. So they visited Muhammad in 630, but in the centuries prior to that, this was a group of people that were almost annihilated, completely extinct. And unfortunately, it was the Himyarite clan, who happened to be Jewish, which is another one of these examples saying, Christians and Jews have always been locked into this eternal struggle. So people unfortunately use that narrative. But imagine what the Christians of Najran were saying in 630, where they're getting this kind of letter from Muhammad, because Muhammad's writing letters to all these leaders. And they're like, Muhammad's like, yeah, basically there's this religion of Islam, which is linked to your religion. And I'm welcoming you to come visit me. And you can imagine the speculation, you know, based on what this community had been previously experiencing and witnessing. And at first, the sources say that they actually rejected Prophet Muhammad's letter. But on the second time, Muhammad came back with another letter, and they went to Medina for 3 days, which is a good sign. They stayed for 3 days. It didn't end after 3 hours or 3 minutes. And they had a dialogue on Christology, some of the stuff that we've been mentioning earlier in this talk. And the sources say that they agreed to disagree, that they had a cordial kind of like, you know, we have our beliefs, you have yours, but like, that's okay. Like Jesus is still a unifying force. We just have different ideas on his divinity. And we also know that the Christians of Najran went to go pray, and they were exiting the mosque, and Prophet Muhammad said, you know, you're already in the house of God, just use this space. And they ended up praying inside of his mosque in 630. And they left after 3 days with a covenant, which is an appendix in the book. And this is a brilliant document. And this book, again, the Islamic Interfaith Initiative by John Andrew Morrow, his other book, let me hold this up again. Sorry, my lighting is so bad. Can you believe both of my lights actually went out in this talk? Like, this is bad luck. So the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. So there are many covenants. It's not just the covenant with the Christians of his time. There's multiple other covenants. And this basically says that the Christians are part of the Islamic country. It's part of the Ummah. And it provides all the things that the Constitution of Medina provided. So freedom of religion, the right to own private property. But the reason why this covenant really stands out is because it's pushing Muslims and Christians to go a step further in their relationship. Like, don't just tolerate each other, help each other to allow them to flourish. So one element of the covenant with the Christians of Najran says, like, if a church falls into disrepair, it's obligatory upon Muslims to help the Christians rebuild their church, and that Muslims should not take it over. They shouldn't take all of the wealth away from that church, that they should actually help to rebuild it. And again, when this book came out in 2013, ISIS was going around Syria and Iraq and destroying churches like all over the place. And then I'm reading these covenants, and it's like literally Prophet Muhammad is telling Muslims to protect places of worship. The covenant, there's many covenants. There's one with the covenants of the monks of Mount Sinai. We have the Christians of Najran, Prophet Muhammad and the Assyrian Christians, one with Jerusalem. So it just goes on and on. And John does an incredible job of really breaking this down.
I mean, I think people don't know in the Middle East that there's Christians living in all the Middle Eastern countries. They speak Arabic. In their churches, they say Allah Akbar, which means God is great, because their services are in Arabic. You know, people don't know that. And also in Palestine and Jerusalem and Bethlehem, there's so many Palestinian Christians, and you know, everybody does their prayer either in Arabic or maybe some Greek. I'm not sure now, but you know, I know before I went to Catholic high school was in Latin, so I had to take 3 Latin, 1, 2, and 3. After Latin 3, I couldn't handle it anymore. It was tough.
And I think it's always been that way, Ola. Like, even if you go back to the time of Prophet Muhammad, if you go to the 6th century and the 7th century, like the time of his life, like I'm confident in saying that there was a diversity of Christian belief in Christian communities in the area. And he was probably seeing all of these communities. Like when he was going through Jerusalem, you know, Jerusalem was the one of the most important cities in the Byzantine Empire at the time. So like, what was he seeing? You know, like, was he seeing books in Aramaic and Greek and Latin? You know, what was he seeing? Who did he interact with? There's a lot that has not been recorded, you know, that has not been written.
Yes.
But so all we can do is kind of theorize. But in the book, people of the book, right in the middle, I have a bunch of pictures, and the first picture is the ancient ruins of the city of Busra, which is in Syria today. And I think it's just important to look at those columns, because a lot of people are going to think like the West, they're going to think Greco-Roman. And like, that's what Muhammad was seeing when he traveled to that part of the world. People kind of miss that historical backdrop and not understanding like who were the political players in this geographical region of the time. And I didn't even mention too, I mean, Juan Cole does a really good job of this, but to the east of the Arabian Peninsula was the Zoroastrian Empire, the Persian Empire, and they were arch nemesis with the Byzantine Empire. So who do you think Muhammad would naturally incline to as an ally? Not saying he'd be anti-Zoroastrian or anti-Persian, but like here you have to the northeast a massive empire that is Christian. And we know the Islamic revelation was very clear from the beginning. Islam is a branch, essentially, of this monotheistic tradition. Another thing I didn't mention, there's so much in this book that I didn't even talk about, but in the year 619, Jerusalem fell. The Christians lost Jerusalem to the Persians, and they are said to have even taken the true cross. And that's 619. That's 4 years after the first Hijrah and 9 years after Muhammad's mission as a prophet essentially began. So imagine Muhammad, the kind of head of state of this new area, still being persecuted in Mecca, and he sees the fall of the Byzantine Christian Empire. Like, what was he thinking? Who were his allies? Interesting. Historical tidbits.
And that brings me to the story of Umar, who was the Caliph of Umar after Radiallahu anhu. My Arabic is not perfect, so excuse me. But he, was actually sent one of his other generals, Khalid ibn Walid, to take over Jerusalem, but in a good way. And then the person that was there said, "No, send me your leader." And so that's when Omar came with the camel and said, "No, we don't want to hurt anybody." So the guy was shocked. So like that's not the way they did it. they killed people, they slaughtered people, but no. So it was taken over very, with nothing. When everybody had their rights, we don't want anybody to leave. He actually made Jewish tribes come back because they had been all killed. So it's interesting, history that a lot of us don't know.
I'll give two contemporary examples. I mentioned earlier when ISIS was running amok in Syria and Iraq and just doing a lot of damage to churches. Like quite recently in the city of Mosul, which, by the way, Pope Francis visited and did a lot of work for a document on human fraternity and the culture of encounter. Once ISIS was gone, it was the Muslim communities that were helping the Christians rebuild their churches. I mean, that's very, very powerful, because Mosul was a relatively cosmopolitan city prior to all this nonsense happening. It was Muslims helping Christians rebuild. And another thing that's quite interesting, at the moment, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we all know the significance of that, I think, in kind of Christian history and Christian identity. And if you're not familiar, like there are, I think, 5 different factions of Christians that hold sway over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because they can't all agree on who's the proper owner. And who has the keys to the door?
I think it's a Muslim family.
A Muslim family that allegedly traces back to Saladin, the great
Saladin, yeah.
Yeah. So all of these, just these like little examples, I'm not turning to these examples and saying, well, like this is the reality and all the bad stuff doesn't exist. But like, there are so many people in this world who, and the media is partly to blame for this, and our politicians and so on and so forth, they'll only look at the bad stuff. And there's so much good stuff that we can also turn to. And I think that's critically important to give hope, to give direction, to provide inspiration. And it's not, as I said, it's not to turn a blind eye to all the bad stuff. We have to deal with that. We have to confront the differences in the political stuff. but let's also focus on the good stuff, please.
Yes. So one
Okay.
one question sneaked into the chat, and I don't want to take too much more of your time, Dr. Craig. But the question is from Irina, and she said there are parts of the Quran where it says you're not allowed to have statues or religious figures, which is true. But she notes here ISIS was destroying those, and you had mentioned ISIS, so ISIS is not representing Islam in any way, shape, or form, and I hope everybody understands that, and just want to make that clear, and
Yeah.
you can too.
Yeah, I mean, ISIS is the fringe of the fringe
It's
of
like the Ku Klux Klan is to Christianity, I would think.
pretty much. I mean, we're talking, there's probably 2 billion Muslims in the world now. You know, I don't know what the head count is on who is in ISIS or sympathetic to it, but it's the fringe of the fringe. And the reason why I brought it up is because it's been imprinted in people's minds because of the media. And again, it's looking at little negative stories and having them paint a broad brush over a quarter of the world's population. There's about 2 billion Muslims in the world. And it's also important to remember, too, that ISIS killed a lot more Muslims than they killed Christians.
Yes.
You know, it wasn't just a war against Christians. It was a war on Shias. It was a war against Sufis. It was a war against the wrong kind of Sunnis. I mean, and it's a fringe. It's the fringe of the fringe. Like the KKK is a good example of it, I suppose.
There somebody also mentioned in the chat that, you know, if one person does one thing, we can't say the whole religion is bad, and one person who, you know, supposedly is going to say that their Muslim does an atrocity, or a Christian. We're not going to blame Christianity, like the one that massacred everybody in New Zealand. We're not going to, if he supposedly claims he's a Christian, we're not going to say that Christian faith is bad. You know, he's just a, you know, horrible individual. And so it's whoever does atrocities in the world, they no way represent the Abrahamic faith or any faith. I believe they don't have a faith, you know, an honest, true faith, you know, because in the Quran, it says if you kill one person, it's like if you killed all of humanity. But if you save one life, it's as if you saved all of humanity. Yeah. So there's so many things in the Quran that speak about that.
I think there's a term that I use and I give to my students. Most of my students, at least in my Muslims and American Society class, are not Muslims, you know, and like this is the first time they've ever learned about anything related to Islam or Muslims. And one of the first things I say on the first day of class, I'm like, there's a tendency to Islam-splain things, right? So if someone goes down the street and robs a 7-Eleven, they happen to be Muslim. Like there's going to be some Islamophobe somewhere going to the Quran and be like, what passage of the Quran legitimizes this? So you tend to Islam-splain it. And the media does that, I think, more so than other faiths. I'm not saying other faiths get a better rep. I think the persecution of Christians happening around the world right now is being blatantly overlooked. But I do think in this context, there is a tendency to view anything that a Muslim does that is against the law or outrageous, all of a sudden it links back to the faith, you know, and sometimes faith is involved in this, right? Like sometimes people will be inspired by whatever, but like you can't point a single finger and saying like the Quran is responsible for this. You know, what happened in Brussels, you remember those awful bombings in Brussels? Like the more information that came out on the perpetrators of this, the more layers of complexity you could see. You know, these people were from essentially impoverished, lack of a better term, like ghettos, and they were running on the streets. Like they were mixed up in all that stuff, like broken homes, broken families, lack of education, lack of opportunity, institutional discrimination. But all of a sudden the media is going to just frame it and say, well, this is part of like radical Islam and ISIS. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's saying in the chat that she states that the ISIS doesn't represent Islam, but unfortunately many Muslims are relating to them during the war in Syria. I'm not sure what you mean by that, if you can expand on that, because I don't think so. Actually, one of my friends, I'm not sure if she's here today, Daisy Khan, she's written a whole book called Wise, W-I-I-S-E. I can send it to everybody on email when I send out the survey. But she actually, you know, details, the all that misinformation that ISIS has about the Quran and what the Quran really says. So
Yeah.
that's very important.
And then, like, investigative journalists have also done a really good job and interesting job in revealing the the daily life of various human beings affiliated with ISIS in cities like Raqqa. And I think there's a couple good articles published in the Guardian. This is like 2015, 2016. And this journalist was basically like, yeah, like they don't even pray. They don't even pray. It's a militia group, and they're just using Islam as their flag, as their calling card. But they're not. Holy, you said it, like they're not living it. Yeah, they're not like living the faith. Like it's just like it's an identity. That's it.
Well, most of the Muslims you meet in the world are very like laid back and very kind, and will feed you until you don't ask. They'll keep on, right, Rebecca? They keep on asking, you have to eat. No, I'm full, no more.
Of course, that's the hospitality. It's the best thing in the world.
Yeah, we're very hospitable. Rabbi Mike put in the chat that there's an important Muslim response to ISIS that most people don't know about, called the letter to al-Baghdadi.
Yes.
And he says he wishes more people were familiar with it. So I made a note of it myself because I'm not familiar with it.
Yes,
so there's always something to always learn. And
I'll just quickly point out, this is a legal response by scholars. I think well over 200 Muslim scholars, essentially point by point refuting as anti-Muslim everything ISIS is doing. I think it's so important. And it's 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, like people who have dedicated their whole life to studying Islamic law, the Sharia. Like these are people who have, they know more than anyone, and just they're able to pick it apart. Like it's so easy, so easy.
I just want to respond to Irina. I'm not Syrian, but Assad is known throughout history, supposedly who is the leader of the Syrian people, to be not a very good leader, or a horrific leader actually, and has been hurting his home people for many, many, many years. So if people that don't want to topple him because he's not Sunni, no, because he is just a really horrible person. And what he's been doing, I have friends who are Syrian who tell me this because I don't know. They just talk that he was just he's horrific. So I can't say it in another word, but I could say a lot worse words. But he's just not a good person.
And I think it's linked to politics too. Like anytime you start talking about Syria, you got to start talking about regional players like Iran's influence in Syria. That's a huge thing. Ultimately, it's about dictators maintaining power, I would say.
I am not going to go into Syrian politics because I am not very familiar with it. So sorry, Irina, but I think that would be like a whole nother program by itself. I'm not that knowledgeable of that myself. So I don't know the percentage of people that support him. All I know is I can tell you from the people that I know that personally. And one of them, I think, is saying in the chat here that is not true. They're made to vote that way out of fear. So a lot of things are forced upon people. You have to understand the place there and how people live. I don't because I've never been to Syria. I don't understand things in Syria. I'm originally from Egypt, and so I could talk a little bit more about Egypt more. But I'm still not as knowledgeable as I would have somebody who lives there and their viewpoints. But so I think we can table that for another conversation. So
Rabbi Mike, good to see you.
Thank you, Rabbi Mike, for being, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Actually, we stayed over and we really appreciate that you've stayed with us such a long time, Dr.
Yeah.
Craig.
Sorry for my lighting. I know my light, both of
It's
them.
okay. We can see you well. You're
All right.
fine.
I apologize. These things, I guess it's only a matter of time. They've been on for 3 years, it seems now. So they gotta die out at some point, I guess.
So I just going to end with your reflection on when you were writing this book. If you could end our talk today with anything that you personally learned that was so eye-opening to you when you were writing and researching this book, that kind of was like, wow, I had no idea about this. And I think that people would like to know, about that. And also possibly any kind, when you were doing all this research, like what kind of, similarities did you see? So I like to always talk about commonality myself. So between Prophet Muhammad and Prophet Jesus, after you did all this research and work.
I would say like what surprised me the most, or what was most rewarding in doing the research, is just that like the depth and the quality of the relationships that were formed between the early Muslims and these various Christian communities. Like it's not a mere tolerance. It's not, just to put it into contemporary context, like, having an interfaith dialogue and everyone's saying the right thing and everyone just goes their opposite way. And, it's a big kind of kumbaya. People are patting each other on the back, and that's great. Like, no, what these relationships that they were forming were life and death. Like 615, the first Hijra. I mean, what would have happened if the Christian king of Abyssinia said, go back? I mean, who knows what would have happened in history? The Christians of Najran, same type of thing. Like they walked away with essentially a new leader, a new moral leader that would provide them and guarantee them their rights. So it's like the depth of their relationships that I find inspiring. And I think it has relevance today because I'm encouraging people to, don't stop with these type of events, like build, as Becca and Ola, you've done, like Ola, you end up going to Becca's like wedding, like things like that, like where you really,
she had halal food. It was amazing.
There you go. So like you
sweet.
lean on each other, like you depend on each other, like your well-being is tied to another person's well-being. And then, I mean, in terms of the commonalities, I know Rabbi Mike just left, but I'll turn to an old Hebrew saying, which is a tikkun olam. So this old Hebrew phrase, is translated to mean basically to heal a fractured world. And this is ultimately what Muhammad and Jesus were doing in their time. They were healing really two different worlds, in two different moments in history. Jesus was, healing the sick, the impoverished, and Muhammad was safeguarding the rights of women and little baby girls and orphans. But ultimately, they were concerned with like the periphery, the people who have been forgotten, left behind, people who feel like they don't have that sense of belonging. So in many ways, aside from their prophetic qualities or divine qualities, however you want to look at it, like these were revolutionary leaders. They were revolutionary leaders in addition to all the hats they wore. And they were ushering much needed change to fight back against tribalism, corruption, greed, violence, all of these things. So they were healing that fractured world. And I think that's perhaps a great way of ending this session, like looking at Prophet Muhammad's life through the prism of Christians, but then having this Hebrew phrase kind of overhanging all of this.
Well, I think our homework for everybody is to go out of their comfort zone. I think that's an important part. Go to your neighbor that you don't know, invite them over for tea, just start doing something from, like you said, the ground up. And that's our personal homework, for each and every one. And I think reading, it gives you so much more, knowledge and opens you up to so many things. And, we share this beautiful world together. So it's all our duties to, coming to work on it. And that's another wonderful way we can work together. Poverty, the environment, things that
Mhm.
affect us all together,
Yes.
that are important. And so I just have to ask, like, the way that you teach with your students, like, what do you envision for them to become, in the future, like leaders, or what do you, how this professor affected you? How in your vision do you hope that your students will be affected by you?
I mean, I hope I encourage them to always like be constructive. I often tell them like it's not enough to just point out the bad things that are happening in the world and to slap that bad thing on the wrist and say bad. Like you have to come up with solutions. You have to come up with constructive ways of moving forward. And I also would add two things. So constructive is important. Number two, inspiring them to be better listeners. I think listening is a lost art. I think just being present with one another, listening, trying to understand, trying to deal with things that are uncomfortable, like these are not easy things to do. And we shouldn't immediately ask people to figure it out or see the light go off. Like it takes time. You have to be patient. You have to be a good listener. And I think ultimately it points to the third thing, which is just to be humble, be humble in the presence of other people. As Socrates said, I know that I do not know. That's always a good way of kind of living your life. God is the ultimate judge, whatever you want to call it, the creator. He's the all, or it is the all being, all knowing. And like, we're just here trying to make sense of it, trying to make the best of it. Pointing fingers and condemning people or canceling people, I don't think that's going to help us. I think we need to be a little bit more humble, be a little bit more keen to be present with one another, to get to know one another and work together for solutions. These are the things that I'm trying to instill. I feel like I'm not doing a good job of it, but I'm trying. I'm trying.
I think you're doing a great job. And
Doing a great job.
you have been touched so many people in the Muslim world that, and I put an ad, I mean, so many people from all over the world were so interested and are very, big fond of you, and follow you on social media very much. So I think you are, doing it in your way, because even my cousins, and my, relatives overseas are very fond of you. So
I'll tell them I said hello. Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
So thank you so much.
So we
really.
have,
Yes.
sorry.
Go ahead, Becca.
I was just going to mention our closing poll
Oh,
now
yeah.
that we've heard from
Yes.
Dr. Craig.
I forgot about
And
that.
You've given us so much information. So we wanted to see how you all are feeling now about your knowledge of Prophet Muhammad's interactions with Christians.
Sorry, I forgot all about that. Oh, much more now. That's good.
Success.
Success.
That's good. Yeah, like I said, I mean, the book is just as it's about Christianity just as much as it's about Islam or Prophet Muhammad. There's a ton of stuff in there about Christianity. So
That's wonderful. So
that's
That's
good.
great.
it seems everybody increased big time, and that was our main desire for this program. So thank you everybody so much. Thank you, Dr. Craig, for staying so much
Thank you.
over time. And thank you to
Thank you.
everybody who did stay and listen to with us all, throughout the program. And if you have any questions that you feel were not answered, or we didn't have time to do it, you can always email me. I put my email in the chat. And thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan to everybody who speaks Arabic out there. That's one way we say thank you in Arabic, or we also say shukran. And thank you to Becca. Thank you to Fatuma for being our wizard in technology here with us. And I'm really, so grateful to you, Dr. Craig, for
thank
joining
you.
us today and sharing with us your so many jewels of knowledge. And I pray that everybody reads his book, really. And salam, everybody, and peace and shalom.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. God
Thank
bless
you.
you.
Great to see
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
God bless.
God bless.
Bye.
Bye.